The reflection in the window. The rain had started just after sundown. A gentle drizzle at first, but it quickly escalated into a relentless downpour that battered against the windows of the small apartment. The kind of rain that didn't just soak you, it soaked your soul. The darkness outside was absolute, and the world felt like it had shrunk down to the size of the dimly lit living room. Sophie sat in the corner of the couch, clutching a cup of cold tea between her hands. It had been a long day at work, one that had already pushed her to her limits. The office was a pressure cooker, and her manager had been in a particularly nasty mood. But it wasn't just work that had worn her down. It was everything. The loneliness. The fear that maybe this life, was all there was. She glanced around the apartment, letting her gaze settle on the half-packed boxes scattered in the corner. She was supposed to have moved months ago. But something always held her back. It wasn't that the apartment was too small or too cluttered. No, it was something else. A feeling. A sensation that had settled in her bones after the first few weeks of living there. She couldn't shake it, no matter how hard she tried. Something's wrong here, she thought, her eyes flickering toward the window. She wasn't sure what exactly, but there was a heaviness in the air, something thick and unsettling that pressed down on her chest. She could feel it every time she stood in the hallway, every time she walked past the mirror in the bathroom. It was like the apartment itself was watching her. But she'd been here for months now. Surely, if there was something wrong with the place, she'd be used to it by now. She took a deep breath and leaned forward, setting the tea on the coffee table. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual, the sound filling the otherwise quiet room. Sophie stood up slowly, the old wooden floor creaking beneath her feet, and made her way to the kitchen. As she reached the doorway, her reflection caught her eye in the hallway mirror. She froze. There, in the reflection, she could see herself, just as she should have been. Tired eyes, slightly disheveled hair, the faintest smile tugging at her lips. But something was off. Something was wrong. She couldn't pinpoint it at first, but then it hit her. Her reflection wasn't moving. No. Not exactly. Her reflection was still. It was as if time had stopped for it. But she could see it, the subtle twitch of her reflection's eyes, the way her lips trembled, as if silently urging her to look away. Sophie blinked, then stepped back into the hallway, but her reflection remained perfectly still. The silence was suffocating. The air in the apartment was suddenly thick with tension, and she felt it, a weight on her chest, a pressure on her throat. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking the spell. She pulled it out, her hands trembling slightly, and saw a text from her best friend, Clara. "Clara, you okay? You seemed a little off today. Want to talk later?" Sophie looked at the message for a long moment, then typed back. "Sophie, I'm fine. Just tired. I'll talk to you later." She slid the phone back into her pocket, her fingers grazing the edge of the mirror as she passed it again. The reflection in the glass seemed almost too still now. Like it was waiting. Waiting for something. She quickened her pace, heading toward the kitchen, trying to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Something was watching her. As she stepped into the kitchen, the sound of the rain outside grew louder. It drummed against the windows, filling the space with a constant, unnerving rhythm. Sophie stood by the sink for a moment, staring out into the dark yard behind the apartment. The wet earth glistened under the dim glow of the streetlights, but even as she looked at the outside world, she couldn't escape the feeling that something was wrong. Her reflection. The way it had waited. The way it had looked like it knew. A shiver ran down her spine. She grabbed a glass from the counter and filled it with water, her hands still trembling. As she brought it to her lips, she heard it, a faint tap, just behind her, soft at first, but unmistakable. It was the sound of footsteps. Sophie froze. Her pulse quickened. Her heart hammered in her chest as she slowly turned, her breath caught in her throat. The kitchen door was shut tight, but she could swear she had just heard someone walk across the floor behind her. The air was colder now, sharper, like the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in the last minute. She set the glass down with a shaking hand and turned slowly, her feet feeling heavy on the floor. She was being paranoid. That's all. The weight of the long day. The stress. But the footsteps came again. Closer this time. She turned again, her eyes frantically scanning the room. The kitchen was empty, the shadows deepening in the corners, the light from the dim overhead bulb casting long, twisted shapes across the walls. Nothing moved. But the footsteps were louder now. They echoed around her, each step reverberating in her skull. Then, from the corner of her eye, she caught it. A shadow. It moved, quickly, across the doorframe. Her blood ran cold. With a gasp, Sophie turned around, rushing to the hallway. She reached for the light switch, flicking it on, her heart in her throat. The hallway was empty. The mirror hung in its usual spot, reflecting the bare walls and the soft, flickering light from the kitchen behind her. She looked at herself in the mirror. Her eyes were wide, her chest rising and falling with quick, shallow breaths. She swallowed hard, telling herself it was just the rain. It was just the stress. But then she saw it. Her reflection wasn't hers anymore. The face staring back at her was twisted in agony, its eyes wide with terror, its mouth stretched into a silent scream. The figure in the mirror was not Sophie, it was someone else entirely, someone unfamiliar, someone who had seen things Sophie could not even imagine. And then, the reflection, her reflection, smiled. It smiled, a wicked, predatory grin that stretched far too wide, its teeth sharp and gleaming in the dim light. Sophie's knees buckled beneath her, and she collapsed onto the floor, her head spinning as the laughter echoed through the empty apartment, resonating in her very bones. And just before everything went black, she heard the voice, soft, quiet, yet somehow too clear. You can't leave. Not now. Not anymore. Part 2, The Unseen Presence. Sophie woke to the sound of her phone buzzing on the coffee table, the light flickering dimly from the screen in the early hours of the morning. She hadn't meant to fall asleep on the couch, but exhaustion had dragged her into a restless slumber. Her eyes snapped open, heart racing as the events of the night flooded back into her mind. She sat up, disoriented, the room eerily quiet except for the persistent hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. The memory of the reflection, the twisted, mocking smile, still lingered like a shadow behind her eyelids. She glanced toward the hallway mirror. It hung in the same place as always, reflecting the bare walls and a flicker of the light from the living room. The apartment was silent. Too silent. She took a shaky breath and grabbed the phone. Clara, Sophie, you up? You sure you're okay? I know it's been a rough day. Just checking in. Sophie stared at the message, her finger hovering over the keyboard. Should I tell her? The thought of sharing what happened last night made her stomach churn. Clara would think she was losing it. Maybe she was. She typed a quick reply, her hands trembling. Sophie, yeah, just tired. I'll be fine. Thanks for checking in. Sophie locked the phone and tossed it back onto the coffee table, rubbing her temples. She had to get a grip. It was just a bad night, a combination of stress and exhaustion. That's all. She was probably just overthinking things. But as she stood up and stretched, trying to shake off the remnants of the strange nightmare, she couldn't help but feel that something was wrong. The apartment felt different now. The walls, once comforting in their familiarity, seemed colder. And the silence, it was too thick. It wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive. Her gaze involuntarily drifted back to the mirror. She shook her head and grabbed her sweater off the back of the couch, trying to ignore the creeping feeling at the back of her mind. She had a lot of work to do today. Maybe getting out of the apartment would help. She stepped into the bathroom to freshen up, the fluorescent light buzzing above her as she ran water over her face. The cold water felt good, grounding. But when she looked up at her reflection, at herself, she froze. Her reflection wasn't quite right. It wasn't the same as before, not like the twisted thing in the hallway mirror. This time, it was subtle. A slight delay in her movements, like the reflection was lagging a second behind her own actions. She blinked, and her reflection blinked a moment after. She smiled, and the reflection's smile didn't reach its eyes. It was empty. Empty and hollow. A jolt of fear gripped her chest. She leaned closer to the mirror, staring at her reflection as if willing it to move in sync with her. But it didn't. It stood still, its eyes fixed on her. The smile had shifted now, barely noticeable but unmistakable. It was as if her reflection was waiting for something. Her breath hitched. She couldn't tear her eyes away. There was a subtle sound behind her, a light tapping at first, almost imperceptible, like someone knocking on the wall. The sound came again, louder this time, accompanied by the faintest scraping noise. Sophie spun around quickly, but the bathroom was empty. No one. No sound. The apartment was silent once more, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant rain tapping against the windows. But the mirror, her reflection, was still there, smiling. And now the eyes were different. They weren't hers anymore. Sophie staggered backward, nearly tripping over her own feet as she backed away from the sink. Her heart was pounding in her ears. It's just the stress, she told herself. It's just your imagination running wild. She grabbed the towel from the counter and wiped her face. Her hands shook as she dropped it into the laundry basket, glancing back at the mirror one last time. Her reflection seemed to follow her movements, but there was something unsettling in the way it moved, as if it knew what she was going to do before she did it. The laughter, the faint, mocking laughter, echoed again in her mind. Sophie couldn't stay here. She needed to leave. She needed to get out of the apartment. She had to. But as she reached for the door, she stopped. The apartment felt smaller, the walls closing in on her. The air was thick with something she couldn't name. She felt trapped. Something was wrong. She wasn't just imagining it. Part 3, The Corridor of Doubt. The sun was high in the sky when Sophie finally left the apartment, her heart still hammering in her chest. The streets outside were busy, people walking by in their usual rush, the world moving on as if nothing was wrong. But Sophie couldn't shake the unease gnawing at her insides. The strange events in the apartment hadn't stopped. She made her way down the sidewalk, her footsteps echoing on the pavement as she tried to focus on something, anything, to distract herself. She glanced at the people around her, at their faces, their expressions. Everyone was moving in their own little bubbles, unaware of the strange thing she had felt in her bones since she first stepped into that apartment. It's just in your head, she thought again, but even she didn't believe it anymore. Something was happening. Something beyond her control. Her phone buzzed again, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was Clara again. Clara, Sophie, are you sure you're okay? I've been thinking about what you said earlier. Want me to come over tonight? We can talk, if you need to. Sophie stopped walking, leaning against a lamppost, her fingers gripping the edge for support. She hadn't told Clara about last night. Or about the mirror. She hadn't told anyone. But the loneliness, the feeling of isolation, it was becoming unbearable. She couldn't keep this to herself. She needed help. Maybe Clara could see things from an outside perspective. Maybe she could tell Sophie she was just overreacting. She typed quickly, her thumb pressing hard against the screen as the words came tumbling out. Sophie, yeah, I think I need to talk. Can you come over tonight? She hit send and put the phone back into her pocket. She glanced around at the busy street, feeling increasingly out of place. The world felt too normal. Like everyone was living in a different reality, and she was stuck in hers, where the boundaries between the real and the unreal had started to blur. When Sophie finally returned to her apartment, it felt different. The silence was thicker, suffocating. She couldn't tell if it was the apartment itself that had changed or if it was just her perception, but as she passed the hallway mirror again, her reflection did something she hadn't seen before, it didn't move. It stared back at her. No smile. No expression. Just two empty eyes, black and hollow, gazing at her with an unblinking intensity. Her heart slammed in her chest. Sophie stumbled backward, panic rising in her throat. She couldn't breathe. The world around her felt like it was shrinking again, closing in on her, suffocating her. And then, just like that, the reflection blinked. Part 4, the door that wasn't there. Sophie couldn't breathe. The mirror reflected her as she staggered back from it, eyes wide with terror. Her reflection, for a moment, had been wrong. It wasn't like before, when it simply smiled or lagged behind her movements. This time, it was still. Silent. But those black, hollow eyes, they seemed to watch her, not in the passive way reflections did, but with something else. Something hungry. Her chest heaved as she backed away from the mirror, the sound of her own breath deafening in the quiet apartment. She had to get out. She needed air. She needed clarity. She needed something. Anything. She grabbed her jacket from the coat rack, her hands shaking violently as she fumbled to zip it up. The hallway felt claustrophobic now. The walls seemed to close in with every step. Sophie's pulse quickened. She wasn't seeing things. She wasn't losing it. The reflection, the eyes, they weren't normal. The apartment was suffocating her, and the strange sounds that followed her in the silence, the tapping, the scraping, she couldn't pretend it was just her mind playing tricks anymore. She had to leave. As she reached for the door, she paused. The room had changed. The hallway, just a few steps away, looked different. The door was further away than it had been. She blinked, her stomach twisting. She felt disoriented, dizzy. No. She wasn't imagining it. The hallway stretched out unnaturally, the light flickering overhead, casting strange shadows along the walls. She could see the door at the end of the corridor, but it seemed wrong. Like it was a door she hadn't noticed before. A door that wasn't supposed to be there. Her heart skipped in her chest. Her hand hovered over the doorknob, and for a split second, Sophie wondered why she hadn't noticed the door's presence before. Where did this come from? She pulled the door open, only to be met with darkness. She couldn't see beyond the threshold. There was no light on the other side, just a void that seemed to reach out and pull her in. She stepped back, her breath shallow as she shut the door quickly, almost too quickly, like she was afraid of what might crawl out of it. She pressed her back against the door, her mind racing. It didn't make sense. She had just been here, minutes ago. That door wasn't here. It couldn't have been here. It wasn't part of the apartment. It wasn't part of her life. Her eyes darted around the hallway. The walls were still, silent. The light above her flickered again, casting long shadows across the floor. Her mind felt like it was spinning. She wasn't sure what to trust anymore. The apartment felt alien, unfamiliar. She had lived here for months, but now, it was like she was walking through a stranger's house. She glanced down at her phone again, desperate for some kind of normalcy. But the screen remained dark, and the text messages from Clara had stopped coming. The last message she had received had been hours ago. Clara, I'm coming over at 7. That was it. No more texts. No check-ins. No follow-up. Sophie's hands trembled as she placed her phone back into her pocket. She couldn't stand still anymore. The feeling of being trapped in the apartment was growing unbearable, and she needed to escape. She couldn't stay here, not tonight. She needed to go somewhere, anywhere, where things felt real. With a shaky breath, Sophie grabbed her purse, determined to leave. But as she stepped into the living room, a strange sensation swept over her. The air was different. It felt heavier, somehow. Like the atmosphere itself was pressing down on her. She turned, scanning the room, and noticed something strange. a book that hadn't been there before, lying open on the coffee table. It was one of the books she had bought a few weeks ago, but she couldn't remember ever opening it. She moved closer, hesitating for only a moment before she picked it up. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded, but the text was still legible. It was an old journal, its leather cover cracked with age. She turned the first page, and as she did, she felt something shift in the air. The temperature seemed to drop by several degrees. Her breath fogged in front of her. The page was written in messy, hurried handwriting. "They are watching me. I can feel them, waiting. It's like they want me to stay, to never leave. But there's something worse than them. There's something behind them. Something that wants to make me its own." Sophie's stomach turned. She turned the page. "I hear the tapping every night. It's like footsteps, moving closer and closer. But when I turn around, no one's there. The door is always just beyond my reach. The walls, they're closing in. They don't want me to leave." Sophie's heart thudded in her chest, her skin prickling with the sudden, overwhelming sense of déjà vu. She had read this before. No, not in this book, but somewhere. It was a memory, a feeling. It was as if the words had been written for her, about her. She quickly flipped through the rest of the pages, each one more frantic than the last, each line more desperate. The journal was filled with terrified ramblings, the scribbled thoughts of someone who had been driven mad by the same things Sophie was feeling now. Her hands trembled as she reached the last page. "I can feel it now. I'm losing myself. I hear the knocking at the door. It's louder. Every night, it gets louder. I try to leave. I try to escape. But when I reach the door, it's not my door anymore. It's someone else's." Sophie slammed the book shut, her pulse racing. Her breath quickened, and the darkness around her seemed to grow thicker. She needed to get out. This place, it was doing something to her. The apartment, the mirrors, the door that hadn't been there before. The book was proof. Proof that she wasn't imagining it. She turned toward the door once more. The hallway was dark now, far darker than it should have been for the time of day. The walls pressed in. The door, the new door, was still there. But when Sophie reached for the doorknob, her hand froze. It wasn't the same door. It was the door from the journal. The one that didn't belong to her. And as she touched the knob, she heard it. The sound. The tapping. It was louder than ever. Part 5. The knock at the door. Sophie's hand trembled on the door handle, her pulse thundering in her ears. The tapping noise had started again, louder now, unmistakable. It was coming from the other side of the door. The door she didn't recognize. The door that hadn't been there before. Each tap felt like a drumbeat in her chest, a rhythmic countdown to something she wasn't sure she was ready for. She could almost hear it calling her, pulling her in. The room behind her felt cold now, colder than before, and the light in the hallway flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward her, like they were trying to reach out and drag her back into the darkness. The tapping stopped. Sophie's breath hitched. It had stopped. But then, something else began. A whisper. Faint at first. So faint she almost thought it was her imagination. But then it came again, louder this time, echoing in the silence. "Let me in." The words were soft, pleading. A voice, but not quite a voice. It sounded like it was coming from behind the door, or perhaps from somewhere deeper. Somewhere inside the apartment. She swallowed hard, her heart pounding as she stood frozen. The whisper came again, and this time, it was accompanied by a rustling sound, like fingers brushing against the wood of the door. "Let me in." Sophie backed away from the door, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She wasn't sure what was happening anymore. None of this made sense. Her hands were clammy, slick with sweat, and the floor beneath her felt unsteady, as if it too was shifting, warping into something she didn't recognize. This had to be a dream. She had to be dreaming. That was the only explanation. The only way she could make sense of this madness. She turned toward the living room, desperate to find something familiar, something that made sense. Her eyes darted across the space, and that's when she saw it. The hallway mirror, now just beyond the entrance to the living room. She hadn't noticed it before, not in the haze of her panic, but now it stood there, its surface glinting in the dim light. Her heart sank. The reflection in the mirror wasn't hers. It was her, but not. It was her face, twisted and distorted, as if some dark force had twisted her very being into something grotesque. Her eyes were wide and empty, black pits that seemed to suck the very light from the room. Her mouth stretched into a smile that was too wide, too unnatural. It was the same smile she had seen the night before. The smile of something that wasn't human. The mirror began to ripple, like water disturbed by a stone, and Sophie's legs gave way beneath her. She fell to her knees, her hands gripping the floor for support. Her breath came in panicked gasps. Her vision blurred, her head spinning as she tried to make sense of what was happening. This isn't real. This can't be real. It's just a nightmare. A nightmare I'll wake up from. But the longer she stayed there, the more the air seemed to press against her, thick and suffocating. The shadows in the apartment seemed to move, to stretch and writhe, as if they had a life of their own. She could feel their weight, their presence, crawling closer. And there, in the reflection, that thing that looked like her, continued to smile. The whisper came again, this time louder, more insistent, "Let me in." Sophie's head snapped toward the door, but she could hear no knocking. No tapping. No sounds at all. Just that voice. "Let me in." The walls around her felt like they were closing in, squeezing the air from her lungs. She could hardly breathe. She tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The apartment was suffocating her, its walls, its mirrors, its shadows pressing down on her, suffocating her from the inside out. Her hand shot out toward the door. She had to get out. She had to leave. But as her fingers brushed the doorknob, it felt wrong. Cold. The knob was slick with something that shouldn't have been there. It was wet. The door, the hallway, it was all wrong. The shadows clung to it like they were alive, like they were reaching for her. Sophie recoiled, her back slamming into the wall as she let out a choked sob. The mirror. The reflection. It was moving again. It was moving. Her doppelganger, the twisted version of her, was stepping out of the mirror. Its movements were unnatural, jerky, as though its body was trying to function on a set of rules it couldn't quite understand. It reached toward her, its hand stretching out with unnatural grace, and Sophie's blood ran cold. The reflection, it wanted her. Sophie's vision blurred, and for a brief moment, the apartment around her seemed to fold in on itself. The door, the hallway, the shadows, they all twisted, they warped, and then... darkness. She fell into it. A deep, suffocating darkness, where the only sound was her own heartbeat, frantic and erratic. The feeling of being watched, of being followed, crept over her, cold and invasive, until she couldn't tell what was real anymore. She couldn't tell where the apartment ended, where she ended, and where whatever was haunting her began. Am I losing my mind? The whisper came again, like a voice from the very walls, "Let me in." Sophie's eyes snapped open, and she found herself on the floor of the living room. Her body ached, her head spinning, but there was no time to focus on that. The apartment had changed again. The hallway, where the door had once been, was empty now. There was no door. No new door. She stood slowly, disoriented, unsure of where she was or what had just happened. Had she dreamed it? Was any of this real? But then, something caught her eye. On the coffee table. The journal. The one from earlier. The one she had read with such terror. It was open again. And on the page, scribbled in frantic handwriting, was a single line. The door will never open again. Not for you. Part 6, The Truth Behind the Door. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the journal in her hands. Her fingers were cold against the pages, but the words on them seemed to burn. The door will never open again. Not for you. The words were written in frantic, jagged script, like someone had been driven to madness by whatever dark force inhabited this place. The apartment, her home, no longer felt like her sanctuary. It was something else entirely now, a prison with walls that shifted and breathed around her. The shadows seemed to move on their own, creeping like something alive. The whispers, the tapping at the door, it was all too real. Too present. She could feel it now, the thick, suffocating weight of the apartment pressing in on her, closing her in from all sides. The walls felt alive. The air felt wrong. She stood up, the journal still clutched tightly in her hands. Her knees were shaky, and she felt lightheaded, but she had to focus. She had to get out of here, had to leave. There was no other choice. The hallway, now empty of the door that had once appeared, stretched in front of her. It was silent, but there was something in the silence, a presence, a feeling that she wasn't alone. Something was watching her. Sophie turned toward the exit, the door she knew she had to open, but as she approached it, she froze. The door wasn't just a door anymore. It had changed. The handle, once just a simple brass knob, was now twisted, warped, as though it had been clawed at. The wood around it was dark, wet, like it had absorbed something unnatural. A black stain spread across the floor beneath it, slowly but steadily, as if it were bleeding into the apartment itself. The space around the door seemed to warp and bend, like the walls were pulling inward, their edges rippling with an unnatural force. It was no longer a door she could just open. It was part of the apartment now, integrated into it as if the two had become one, an unholy union. And then, the whisper came again. "Let me in." Sophie flinched at the sound, her body trembling. She reached for the door handle, her fingers trembling against the twisted metal. The moment she touched it, the whisper intensified, becoming louder, clearer, more desperate. "Let me in. Let me in. Let me in." The words rattled in her skull, the voice feeling like it was coming from inside her head, clawing at her sanity. She tried to pull her hand away, but it was as if the door itself held her there, pulling her in. Her heart raced, her body shaking as the black stain beneath the door spread further, reaching out like tendrils, twisting and writhing with malevolent energy. The floor beneath her feet felt like it was sinking, like she was being pulled into the very earth itself. "No!" she screamed, jerking her hand away from the door. But the moment she let go, she stumbled backward, her head spinning. She had to get out. There was no other choice. The walls were closing in, the floor was cracking, and she was suffocating under the weight of whatever had taken hold of this place. This isn't real. It's not real. It can't be real. She clutched the journal tightly, the words written in it echoing in her mind, "The door will never open again. Not for you." Her breath hitched. Was that true? Was the apartment never going to let her leave? Was she trapped in some nightmare from which there was no escape? Maybe she was. She reached for her phone again, desperate for any connection to the outside world. Maybe if she called Clara, someone who wasn't trapped in this madness, she would understand. She could help her. But when she unlocked the phone, there were no messages. No calls. The screen was empty. Her heart sank as she dialed Clara's number, praying for any kind of response. It rang once. Twice. Nothing. A cold shiver ran down her spine as she stared at the screen, the silence deafening in her ears. Where is she? Then, something caught her eye. In the reflection of the screen, something moving behind her. Her reflection. But it wasn't her. It wasn't her. Her reflection stood there in the corner of the room, its eyes wide and staring, its body trembling, its mouth agape in a silent scream. But it wasn't Sophie's reflection. Not really. It was distorted, warped. Like the version of herself she had seen in the mirror before, that thing. The reflection reached toward her. It was coming closer, its hand extending toward her. But this time, it wasn't just a reflection. It was real. Sophie spun around, her breath catching in her throat as she faced the mirror. There was nothing there. Only the empty space behind her. The apartment was silent. But she could feel the eyes of that thing, her thing, on her. Watching. Waiting. The whispers came again, louder now, filling the entire apartment. Let me in. Let me in. Let me in. Sophie's vision swam, the world tilting. Her knees buckled, and she fell to the floor, clutching her head in her hands as the voices, the whispers, the tapping, all of it, flooded her mind. The shadows twisted in the corners of the room, their movements becoming more erratic, more alive. Her thoughts felt like they were being pulled apart, scattered into a million pieces. She could feel the walls closing in on her, the apartment's darkness suffocating her. The door, the reflection, the whispers, they were all part of something far greater, something that had been waiting for her. Let me in. The voice was right next to her now. She screamed. But it didn't matter. The apartment, the room, it didn't matter. Because Sophie knew the truth now, the truth that had been with her all along. The apartment had never been hers. She wasn't living in an ordinary building. She was living in a trap, a living, breathing thing that had taken her in. And it wasn't going to let her leave. Not now. Not ever. Sophie's eyes locked onto the door once more. And this time, she knew. There was no escape. The door would never open again. Not for her. Part 7, The Price of Escape. Sophie was no longer sure how long she had been sitting there, her body slumped on the floor, her back against the wall. The darkness seemed to press against her, closing in from all sides. The whispers had quieted for now, but the sense of dread, of being watched, never left. The apartment had become something other, something alien, something that was alive in a way that no ordinary home could be. She had always felt a slight unease here, even in the beginning, a flicker of something off in the corners of her mind. But now. Now she understood. It was never her apartment. It had never been. She had been a guest, a reluctant participant in its dark and twisted game. And it wasn't finished with her yet. Sophie's thoughts were hazy, a fog of terror and confusion swirling in her mind. The door, the hallway, the mirror, they were all connected in ways she couldn't explain, like pieces of a puzzle that she was desperately trying to solve, only to realize that the puzzle itself was a trap. She needed to leave. But as much as she tried to will herself to rise, to push herself to the door, her body refused. She felt heavy, immobilized by the weight of something unseen, something far worse than physical exhaustion. It was the weight of despair. There is no escape. That thought kept repeating itself, like a mantra, over and over in her mind. The journal had said it. The door had said it. She wasn't meant to leave. Sophie finally pushed herself to her feet, her body shaky, as if the floor beneath her had shifted into something uneven. The apartment had started to feel less like a space and more like a living organism, breathing in time with her, pulsing with a dark, malignant energy. Her hand shook as she reached for the door again. This time, the whispers were louder, more demanding. Let me in. Let me in. Let me in. She didn't know if she could take it any longer. The voices were inescapable, crawling into her thoughts, invading her mind. The moment she reached for the door, the familiar cold sensation seeped into her fingers, wrapping around her hand like a physical presence. She could feel something tugging her, urging her to open it. But Sophie stopped. Her hand hovered over the knob, frozen. It was then that she noticed it. A faint glow, coming from underneath the door, leaking out from the edges. It was a light unlike anything she had seen before. It wasn't warm or comforting. It was wrong. Pale, sickly. Like it had come from somewhere deep within the apartment, something that was festering in the dark corners of this place. Sophie took a step back. What was that? What was beyond the door? The real door. The one that had been hidden all this time, the door that had never been meant for her. Without thinking, Sophie opened it. A cold gust of air slammed into her face, and for a moment, she felt weightless, like she was falling, or floating. The world tilted, and she staggered forward, her heart racing as she crossed the threshold. The hallway beyond stretched infinitely before her, a narrow, suffocating space that seemed to go on forever. The walls were no longer ordinary walls. They were dark, pulsating with a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. The floor beneath her was slick with something wet, something that moved, alive, as though the very ground beneath her was breathing, moving with a life of its own. The light from the door flickered as it began to close behind her, and Sophie turned, her eyes wide with terror. The door was no longer the same. It wasn't the door she had seen moments ago. It had changed, as though it had absorbed something from her. Its surface was cracked and uneven, with dark veins spreading across the wood. The glowing light beneath it had intensified, and it seemed to be pulling her in, like a siren call. The whispers had intensified as well, now a cacophony of voices, shrill and demanding. "Let me in. Let me in. Let me in." Sophie took a step back, but the walls around her were closing in, the space narrowing like a claustrophobic trap. She reached for her phone again, hoping, praying, that she could contact someone. But the screen was black, lifeless. Nothing. The walls shifted again. The hallway, now seemingly endless, twisted and turned like a labyrinth. The dark stain on the floor continued to spread, creeping like tendrils of something that wanted to consume her, to drag her deeper into the darkness. She couldn't think. She couldn't breathe. The sound of footsteps. But they weren't hers. Sophie whirled around, her chest tight. Her pulse roared in her ears. The sound of those footsteps was coming from behind her, slowly, methodically. She turned and began to run, her footsteps slapping against the wet floor, but the hallway seemed to stretch farther ahead, elongating as though it was alive, shifting with every step she took. The air grew thicker. The temperature dropped. Sophie's breath was coming in ragged gasps now, and her eyes darted around wildly, searching for an exit, any exit, but the hallway only continued to unfold before her. There was no end in sight. The footsteps grew louder. And then, the door. It was ahead of her, now. The door she had been searching for. But it wasn't the door to the outside. It was the door that had been hidden all along. The door that had been waiting. She reached for it, her hand trembling, but the moment her fingers brushed the knob, the entire hallway seemed to shudder, the walls around her convulsing, as if the apartment itself was alive and angry. She turned the knob. And the moment she opened the door, everything stopped. The hallway. The whispers. The sound of footsteps. The apartment itself. It all fell silent, as though everything had been holding its breath. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest as she stepped through the threshold. And into the dark. The room beyond the door was empty. Or at least, it appeared to be. There was no furniture, no walls. Just an endless void. It stretched on, far beyond her sight, like a chasm, like an endless pit. The floor beneath her feet was soft, yielding. It was like walking on sand, but it wasn't sand. It was something darker. Something alive. Sophie stepped forward, her body shaking uncontrollably. The air was thick, suffocating, and she could feel the pressure in her chest, the weight of the darkness around her. And then, from the void, it spoke. The voice, the thing that had been whispering to her, that had been chasing her through the halls. It was behind her, in front of her, all around her. "You should have stayed." Sophie's breath hitched. She turned around, but there was no one there. Only the darkness. And then she saw it. A figure, standing in the distance. It was her. It was her, but not. It was smiling. The smile was twisted, grotesque. It reached too wide, stretching too far, as if its very mouth was tearing apart. You should have stayed, it repeated. And Sophie understood then. There was no escaping. Not for her. Not for anyone.